There we go. All right, we're in. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. We're back today with Samuel. He's been on before previously to talk about some religion, theology, history, methodology, all that. Today he's back to talk about Christian Universalism. Samuel, thank you for coming back on.
It's a pleasure. I look forward to it once again.
Yep, me too. If you're on Facebook, you'll find Samuel in multiple groups there, arguing for universalism and against some really bad arguments contra universalism. So that's what we figured we'd talk about today. We've been in conversation about this for a while. We both kind of find the Christian Universalist picture an attractive view, for me at least, hypothetically. So yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. We've both been kind of active in some groups, been discussing this online and everything. So if you wanted to, I guess we could start by going into, if you want to talk a little bit about your background or kind of what drew you to universalism, I guess arguments, general draw, where it came from. So yeah, I figure if you want to go into that a little bit, we can talk, I guess, a little bit about the attractiveness of the theology or eschatology.
Yeah, sure. So I was, as I said in my previous video with you, I was raised in a Christian home like you, raised in the Baptist tradition in New Zealand where I live, which is fortunately not as fundamentalist as more of the Reformed Baptist churches in America. But nevertheless, it was a broadly conservative upbringing. General conservative theology. But one plus side, I guess, is that despite that, I never really was completely and hardly sort of indoctrinated, I guess, to believe in an eternal conscious torment hell, which is kind of good. So I wasn't really scared into, unlike many fundamentalists or conservative people that I've heard many stories of people in America, friends, who tell me that they were, fed into this belief, and it sort of still haunts them to this day, even if they don't hold to it now. Unlike those sort of people, I guess I was blessed in a sense because I. Even though, up until about, 18 or 19, I still vaguely held to this traditional idea that some people will go to hell forever. I never really, it wasn't something that I actively argued or tried to defend, in a kind of, in an apologetic way to my friends. And it was more, the only argument I really took seriously, which I no longer do, as I'll later explain, was C.S. Lewis's argument, of hell. So in C.S. Lewis's great masterpiece, The Great Divorce, he describes hell as a state of being locked on the inside. So, hell, you choose hell rather than God sending people to hell. There's this famous line in the book where he says there's two types of people in the world. Those who those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those whom God says to them, "Thy will be done." So it's kind of, there's two groups, who sort of choose, and that word "choose" is important. They choose. They choose either, life, eternal bliss with God forever, if they've accepted Jesus, before they die, or those who choose, hell forever. And apparently these people do so willingly, with no, qualms of conscience. They would enjoy choosing hell forever, which I'll later go on to explain is so ridiculous on many levels. But yeah, so that was, just to begin, I guess, that was the background I was brought up with that. That's like the only view of hell that I took really seriously. And even then, as I said, it was only until maybe two years ago that I actually questioned the coherence of that so-called free will defense of hell. And so yeah, I've been I guess after I questioned that view, I've been a universalist almost by default for the last couple of years, even if I haven't articulated in as clear terms as I have in the last year or so after encountering David Bentley Hart, of course. Yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah,
About
that's good. Yeah, we did want to go into the first part of, I mean, as Samuel alludes to there, we're talking about David Bentley Hart a fair bit because he's someone that's been kind of influential on both of us. And his recent book, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, Universal Salvation, his book kind of on universal. I mean, he's been an open universalist for a while, and he's given talks on it. People have like written responses that have generally been pretty bad. And so he's kind of, there's no secret he's been a universalist, but he wanted to have like a book length treatment out. And he even says in the book he doesn't really expect it to convince most people because their kind of prior convictions are going to be so strong. That's not really the point. He's kind of wanted to get it out there, basically. So we've both been reading that book a little bit. I know Samuel's finished it probably a couple times, and I'm a little ways in. I kind of got caught up with other stuff. I'm about 30% through. So yeah, it's really good. His whole work is great. So that's good. Yeah, good framing that. And he was actually kind of my first exposure officially to universalism. We have broadly similar stories as we went into last time, raised in more fundamentalist Christian environments. And so then I'm of course in a different place now, but I really enjoy David Bentley Hart's work, especially his book like The Experience of God, and all of his stuff. His articles like on the New Atheists are really fun to read. So he's kind of hooked me. And so, but then him exposing me to universalism, I kind of hadn't considered it as much before. I'd kind of always just taken the stock views. I remember not that long ago taking the stock views of like scripture being against it and things like that, which is not. There's no really good arguments there, or at least none that are sufficient to outrule the blatant logical contradictions. But yeah, so I guess we could start off talking. We wanted to kind of go through. Probably actually gonna have to end up doing multiple videos on this topic because there's so much here that's good and we need to go through, and there's like such a history. I think we wanted to briefly kind of very broadly go through with a kind of an outline similar to what Hart does in the book, just kind of framing the question of hell and salvation and like what it is. And then I think pretty much probably most of what we're going to get through with this is just the doubting is into the next section, which is doubting the answers. Just kind of talking about the typical views of hell, the typical responses, and why they're bad. So I guess what I'll do is I'll really quickly talk about something Hart kind of opens the book with and what's kind of drawn me to it, and then I'll let Samuel go off of that. If you have anything to say on that, or wherever we want to build from there. But one thing Hart talks about in the book is that he just kind of like his contemplations about the possibility of, people being eternally consciously tormented. He just kind of always found that to be sort of intuitively morally absurd. And then hearing stories about, like in certain veins of, say, like the Buddhist tradition, this is one he draws out in the book a lot. In the Buddhist tradition, story of these kind of savior figures called the Bodhisattvas, who like once achieving nirvana, rather than like passing through to nirvana, they won't like pass on to the next plane of existence until they make sure every other being that's suffering goes through before them, goes through to the next like stage of existence before them, or goes through to nirvana before them. And so in some of the stories, this included these figures even traveling through like the different planes of hell, what they conceived as hell, to find souls, to find people and pull them out and rescue them, make sure they got to the nirvana and the state of bliss first before they entered it. And so Hart, in the book, he outlines like reading that and just kind of being worried that Christianity was he's like, I'm naturally competitive, kind of worried Christianity was being outdone in the grace and mercy department, because you supposedly have this story of this all-loving God who the majority of his creation, or even if it's an equivalent amount or a little bit lesser, but for most people's stories, the majority of his creation he creates with full knowledge of them being eternally tormented at the end of their story, and he yet creates them anyways. And so that's definitely not as morally complete as a picture as, say, this Buddhist picture. So he was kind of initially very drawn to some of these Eastern stories, and he even recounts going through almost leaving Christianity just because he thought the doctrines of hell were so morally confused. He's like, well, if this is true, this is way too morally confused of a religion to be taken seriously. And then he kind of draws his story from there of finding he's always had like a draw to the East, so finding the Eastern thinkers and the Eastern Church and the Eastern philosophy, and how that kind of Eastern Christianity had more sympathies towards Universalism, and he read those. And so I think it is funny because I think a lot of people find this sort of to be just kind of intuitively, they find it morally absurd and repellent and abhorrent. Like I know there's a pretty popular atheist YouTuber, counter apologist. His real name's John Lopalato. He's recently been one of the co-hosts on Real Atheology, but he had like his own YouTube channel and even like a blog and everything. And he kind of like talks about how one of his reasons for leaving Christianity was like arguments from hell and how absurd that was. So I think a lot of people kind of share that intuition of like, wow, this is really terrible. And under DBH has even talked about how teaching this to children that like most of humanity is going to be eternally tortured is like psychological abuse. And he's even called eternal constant doctrines like psychological terrorism, I believe, and which is kind of backed by the fact that people like St. John of Chrysostom admitted that it was sort of a conversion tactic for some of the early Christian churches. But yeah, so that I think it's kind of it's definitely an interesting thing to grapple with when we're talking about framing this question, and why it's important is because a lot of people put so much stake of their religion into this particular eschatology, and so it's kind of a big thing that people just find repellent. But it's important to note, for one thing, that Christianity, certainly not theism, lives or dies by this eschatology of being committed to hell, or definitely not an eternal hell. So I guess that's part of the framing I wanted to talk about just briefly, of like, this is kind of a big thing that's been a big part of Christian history, but is now becoming a big part of why people are doubting it and thinking it's sort of morally confused, and sort of inherently a contradictory picture there. So I want to talk a little bit more about the atonement, but I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say there, build on anything I said, or talk more about some framing questions we need to go through. So yeah, anything there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's common for, we'll talk about Calvinists later, but it's common for Calvinists, to say in response to something that you've just said, I don't care about, emotion, what you're emotional, I care about reason, which is ironically the same dichotomy between emotion and reason that the new atheists, make, and trying to dismiss religion. I just think, yeah, it's really interesting how it seems to me that both what I called in my last video, do you remember when I talked about the conservative apologists on the one hand and the radical skeptics or the new atheists, they tend to be two sides of the same coin, and in creating all these false dichotomies or dualisms, right, between faith and reason, and either conceiving of God in a kind of, forgive the technical language, but in a univocal way, where language is collapsed into one meaning, or an equivocal way, which is sort of where the word good can mean one thing in one context, then the word good or just can mean another thing in another context, which is usually how Calvinists in particular, they attempt to justify the morally intuitive how idea of how hell is, it goes against our reason, the idea of infinite retribution being disproportionate to the finitude of the human. These are just so obvious philosophical, logical reasons for why the doctrine, even in its more sophisticated versions, is intuitively nonsensical in the real sense of the word. It makes no sense. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting how, in the modern context, going back to something you said earlier, how for a lot of people, particularly in the from the, I guess, the late modern, so the last 2 centuries, particularly from the 19th century, which is my reading of history, people like Charles Darwin, who everyone knows about, of course.
Yeah.
Charles Darwin. If you read his writings, his letters, he says explicitly that the main reason why he rejected Christianity or a personal God is because of the doctrine of hell. That's what Charles Darwin says. He says, that he can't conceive of how his family members who don't believe in Christianity, how they would go to hell, according to the traditional view. And so I don't think that Christians should so lightly dismiss the moral and the moral dimensions, the moral and emotional dimensions to why this doctrine is abhorrent to people who are genuinely trying to believe, and who genuinely, they're not. So these are agnostics, kind of like you in a sense, who don't want to dismiss Christianity. In many ways, they may want to believe in Christianity. Such an attractive worldview to hold to, right? And yet, people continue to this day to alienate unintentionally or intentionally these sort of people by ignoring their concerns. So I think it's saddening in many ways that a lot of our culture is, a lot of Christians in our culture, particularly conservative Christians, they are just blind, to the way in which to the way in which our culture has shifted. Firstly, which is a conservative thing that they conservative worry, anxiety about change over time, I guess. Yeah. But also just like the perceived need to defend this particular aspect of the tradition. Like, it is not a need. I just say it completely bluntly. It does not dilute, but rather would enhance Christianity and the plausibility of it to so many agnostics, I think, if you just completely abandoned the traditional view of the eternality of hell. So that includes, the traditional view of eternal conscious torment, as well as the more modern views of annihilationism. The increasingly popular alternative now for conservative evangelicals to try and argue that instead of, God outsourcing a concentration camp of people, humans, rather what God does is that he annihilates them on the spot, after they die. So, which is no less, it's only slightly less morally abominable, I think, that view. But
a little bit of progress, but Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's just some of my thoughts on what you've just said. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think you're right there, because I remember not long ago you and I were talking with another friend of ours about this, and I think he said at one point that, like, out of all the Christians, like, he reads and like keeps up with, like, David Bentley Hart's one of the only ones that's actually like preaching good news, like in terms of like his message of the gospel, like one of the only ones that's actually like good news, like. And so that's definitely, it seems to be true. Like, what's the good news apart from universalism, that, like, some people are going to be saved, some are going to be either destroyed or just tortured forever? Like, if it's good news for like me, that doesn't mean it's good news simpliciter. It's so I think he's right that, like, he's one of the only ones, like, whose gospel message is actually like as good as it claims to be. Only one really worthy of its name. So that's good there.
Was this Shane who said this to you? Because Shane's also said, it's a mutual friend of ours, he said a similar thing to me.
Yeah, no, Shane said that was Shane, because I think it was the three of us were in a call the other day and we were talking about universalism, so that's what he said. Yeah, shout out to my boy Shane Wagner. Him up on Facebook too. He's gonna get him on here soon to talk about philosophy of mind. Dude's a genius. But so and I think he's right there too. I think you're both right. That, like, yeah, this is one of the only, and that's kind of Hart's point too. Like, this is the only way to make this whole picture make sense. Like, this is the only way in which this story has an end fitting its characters and fitting its setup and fitting its narrative and everything. It's the only end for humanity that makes sense. It's the only end for God that's fitting of who God actually is.
Yeah.
It's the only picture in which God is actually God. Everything else kind of makes him sort of this finite, petty, you know, power hungry. I don't even know what noun to throw in there, but like, there's we'll get into that a little bit more too, like how this plays into pictures of God, because because we'll talk about this when we're doubting the answers, but like, basically the common Calvinist answer of God, condemning most people to hell as an expression of his sovereignty is somehow justified and good, which just makes God some tyrant that, for expressing power as power's sake, consigns, a multitude of things to eternal torment. But we'll get into that more. I don't want to give away too much. So I think one thing we need to talk about too, that Hart goes through in his framing the question section, and we talked about this a little bit, is kind of how, kind of in the background, there's theories of atonement at play here, and kind of the proper Christian understanding of what the atonement is, how God actually was paid off. So I'll want you to talk some more about this, but basically, the common answers, Hart goes through the common answers of the bad, that like, God just needed to kind of beat up on Jesus, quote unquote, to like get, in order to pay this price, or that we somehow like owed God a debt as this original. Now, of course, at play there is a sort of the doctrine of original sin, as understood in the West, that the East never really adopted. And so in that view of salvation, of like, we kind of owed, like, each person owes this like infinite debt to God because of this, these finite transgressions translate to some infinite transgression against him, and so we all owe God, and so Jesus had to like basically appease God's wrath, like pay off this debt. And that's really probably the most common theory of atonement. He talks about, and I know he has a good analogy against that with like credit card debt, but he kind of goes into
say that,
the proper Christian understanding of the atonement, or at least how the East has always understood, or the early Christians, as a story of rescue, more so from death, as opposed to like this story of like appeasement or whatever. So that's just kind of the brief tease of it, but I'm sure you'll want to go a little more into that. So I think I probably missed a couple of the other atonement theories that are bad, but if we don't need to play those in, I mean, the others are more common. So yeah, whatever you want to say there on like atonement, go ahead if you got anything you want to cover.
Yeah. I've actually just a week ago recorded a video with one of my other friends I've made on Facebook, Jordan Apodaker, on atonement theories, which should come out soon. So perhaps you could direct listeners to, to shout my own horn, I guess, to another video that might come out soon. But just briefly, I guess, on atonement, which is usually seen, by skeptics and unbelievers as, according to this idea of penal substitutionary atonement, which is the most popular version of atonement defended by conservative evangelicals nowadays. It's, once again, I think the almost desperate attempt to defend this doctrine at all costs by said conservatives is in many ways being blind to cultural concerns. The way in which, most ironically, the moral qualms against the idea of the necessity of God's wrath being satisfied in Jesus dying on the cross, how these moral qualms ironically arise from Christian moral convictions, and so it's a great irony of the West, the history of the West. I think that the same worldview, Christianity, is produced both the more what I could call the more retributive aspects to justice or the atonement, as well as the more restorative aspects to justice. Because I see this as sort of a tension within like the logic of Christianity as itself, as it erupted in the ancient pagan, in the Greco-Roman world. There's this tension between justice being just about paying the penalty, for sin, or paying the penalty within a Roman context, right? There's a tension between that and the idea, the biblical, the Jewish idea of how justice, the idea of justice in the Jewish mind is more about, not about appeasing the wrath of the God, like in the more pagan, but rather it's about restoring relationship with Yahweh, Israel's God. And it is true that, Israel, no less than its ancient Mesopotamian neighbors, they did animal sacrifice in order to achieve this atonement. Atonement literally means, at one mint, being at one with the deity, right? But the Israelites still, they didn't. The goal of justice was always to restore. You see this all over the Old Testament and the New Testament, particularly in the prophets, about how always after God judges the Israelites and punishes them for their sins, there's always a depiction of Yahweh stretching out his hand and with the aim of restoring Israel from exile, which is later became a metaphor for bondage to sin and death, right? Right. And now this would link into to talking about the more appropriate language of atonement, which is found in the Eastern Church Fathers, right? The idea of cosmic rescue, the idea, to quote from the book, rather than, this idea that there has to be a legal, there's a legal penalty which has to be satisfied or met, in order for God to, I guess, become less angry with his creation, who he's made out of his supposed love. There needs to be, rather than that, the idea of to quote, the epic of God descending into the depths of human estrangement to release his creatures from bondage to death, penetrating even into the heart of Hades, which is the Greek word for the underworld, to set the captives free. And this is biblical language once again, setting the captives free, Isaiah, and recall his prodigal children and restore a broken creation. And so, as David Bentley, I'll just call him DBH from now on, so I don't have to say his whole name. As DBH says in the book, in the section we're talking about, the sacrifice of Christ was not a ransom paid to the Father, but rather a lutron or an antilutron, which is the Greek word, which is better translated like a manumission fee, which is more of it's a language used to purchase the release of slaves who were held in bondage. So the idea, it's a metaphor for the idea of how humanity is enslaved, in bondage to this death called death. So this household called death and sin, right? And how God, he descended to the depths of the broken creation in order to rescue, not to satisfy a penalty which is committed by an ancient distant ancestor, but rather because out of his infinite love, which is the same reason why he creates humanity in the first place, creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. it's the same expression of God's infinite goodness expressed in becoming incarnated in the person of Jesus, right? Which is something I talked about a little bit in the previous video, if listeners did watch that. Yeah, do you mean to mention that analogy he uses? It's quite funny about the...
Yeah, sure, go ahead. That's honestly good.
Yeah, so I just have to quote this. There's some eminently quotable aspects to the book which have to be publicized. So that he characterizes the traditional view of atonement, the penal substitutionary view, as the coin of some sublimely circular transaction wherein God buys off God in order to spare us God's displeasure. Rather like a bank issuing itself credit to pay off a debt it owes itself, using a currency it has minted for the occasion and certified in its value wholly on the basis of the very credit it is issuing to itself. You get that whole sentence? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. But yeah, it's quite, yeah. So that, I think that is the tenor, or that's the focus, more the focus of both the New Testament writers and the early church fathers, right up until about I guess Athanasius in the 4th century. They, even if you can find language of substitution, the idea of Jesus dying for our sins, even if you can find that language in people like Athanasius, which you can, they always emphasize the idea of cosmic rescue, the idea of how humanity is enslaved into corruption and death, and how humanity sort of fading away in a sense. And then Christ, came to set us free. It's a triumphant language. There's a model which I often called Christus Victor. That's a model of the atonement which is popularized by a Swiss theologian called Gustav Aulén. I won't go into that because we discussed that in the video that we had. But so I think it's important to go back for people to go back, whether they're Christians or not, to go back to the early church fathers, particularly David Bentley Hart's favorite and my favorite, Gregory of Nyssa, who was probably the best and most eloquent defender of apokatastasis, which is the Greek word for universalism, essentially. And I think that would solve a lot of the issues we have with atonement. A lot of so. But anyway, I hope that was helpful so far. Even though that's only a minor aspect to his book, talking about atonement. I think it's important.
Yeah, we're still framing it though, so that all is important. One thing, I don't know if I thought maybe DBH's favorite was Saint Maximus the Confessor, but I'm not sure. He's got.
Oh no, he's like the second or third favorite. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, all right. We'll have to fact check that. But
it's definitely Gregory.
Saint Maximus Confessor, and then of course Gregory of Nyssa is well up there, along with Saint Origen, and then plenty of others. I know you're a fan of Erasmus, John Erasmus too.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so
all Christian
really
humanists,
too, just given how broad that penal substitutionary view is, and how it kind of like is imbued with a lot of background ideas about like what constitutes like our relation and everything to God, and also it kind of, because very much at work there is the idea of original sin, which has largely been rejected by the Eastern tradition, at least in the formulations that it is in like the West, because obviously it's pretty morally absurd when we are doing ethics and moral philosophy, talking about moral and ethical responsibility. I mean, you can't be culpable for something someone else did, so the whole notion of inherited infinite guilt is just so patently absurd. It's not really worth taking seriously, to be frank. So that's why it's much more for one thing, interesting. For two, makes more sense, and three, more fitting with the character of God, to see the redemption picture and the whole story as a much more metaphysical problem, and the evil as a much more metaphysical issue, and us being like in this bondage to death. And then, of course, the view of Christ as a more metaphysical, the logos, penetrating the world and penetrating even, as I was talking about the Buddhist Bodhisattvas, with Christ after the crucifixion, penetrating even to the depths of hell, and in triumph over all the devils and the spirits there that had control, and kind of freeing us from the archons in a way to kind of go almost Gnostic. So yeah, so I think it's important to get that on the floor too, kind of just how radically different the entire. It's like it's almost a completely different story. I was talking to some friends about this, and like how the Eastern view of redemption and God is so radically different from like the Calvin's picture. Is not even really the same God that you're believing in or worshiping the same religion, because I mean the pictures there between the original sin and penal substitutionary atonement, as opposed to the much more metaphysical and much deeper problem and much more significant redemption and salvation from that problem, you find in like the Eastern tradition, especially the Orthodox Universalist camp. I think there's a lot more there of substance. So it is helpful to go into. I think it's good as we're framing the question to kind of frame, because we're talking about universalism. We're talking about universal salvation, and so what that salvation is and what it consists of and why it's significant is, of course, important to this whole question we're framing. So I think at this point I want to go into maybe, I don't know if we have anything else we need to go into there. I'm trying to think. Might need to move on to the doubting the answers section, perhaps. Talk a little bit about, because we touched on it there briefly a little bit with, incorrect views of the atonement and why they're wrong. But I think for this video, mostly we're going to be able to cover just like opposing accounts and like arguments contra universalism or for eternal torment or for eternal hell that are obviously pretty wrong. So I don't know, we need to say anything more on framing, you think? Or are we good to jump into kind of some doubting the answers?
No, I think, I mean, I was going to make a comment on original sin, but...
oh yeah, go ahead and do that first, then. That's important.
Okay, if you really want me to. I was just going to say that it might be too long. But the brief comment I was just going to make was that the reason why in the East, the Greek Orthodox East, they weren't susceptible to that, that logical and moral paradox of inherited guilt, is because they didn't mistranslate this verse in Romans 5, which was mistranslated in the Latin Vulgate as saying, in him and Adam all sinned, whereas the Greek, it doesn't actually say that. It says where upon all sinned. So so it's the idea of how Adam and Eve sinned, and we're not guilty for what they did, but rather what we did is that we followed the same pattern. So after Adam and Eve they sinned, and we also sinned in the same way. So there's no idea of, like, even in the New Testament or the Bible in general, the idea of original sin is just a complete fiction. Like it's a fantasy imposed on the text. There's no, at least in the sense of inherited guilt. I mean, I know this is another debate, but I know that there's still ways of defending original sin by conservatives, but just to criticize this version of it, if anyone is a little bit more fussy about other versions, we could talk about that later, of course. But anyway, should we move on now to the doubting the answers section that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think, well, it's interesting because like there's a verse parallel to that, talking like for an Adam all sin, but then it's like, then in Christ all be made alive, and it's like, well, there you go, there's some universalism there. So universalism in the Bible. If one's universal, the other's got to be. So yeah, I guess we should move into doubting the answers. I think he lays out 2 or 3 significant pictures that are wrong. Well, I want to talk about, we want to talk about a little bit, of course, our views of God, and the Eastern view, and like the correct Christian view of God, and how that plays in here, because that's going to be part of his critique. Is like, Well, I'll let you. I do want to hear you talk about the free will defense and why you doubt that, because I think DBH's arguments against that are really convincing. But but also just kind of as I touched on earlier, like any of the traditions that simply place more value on God's sovereignty when sovereignty means power, arbitrary power for power's sake, and somehow they appeal to this notion of like God's glorification being this penultimate thing, and so he's justified then in doing whatever he wants simply as expressions of power in order to gain more glory for himself. And I think that's a picture that's really important to counter, because that's just such apart from, as I said, being super petty and superficial and just like outright tyrannical, it just kind of completely ignores so much else about God. Like, sure, he's powerful and just and seeks glory, but he's also like infinitely loving and good and has like infinite boundless mercy. So that's, of course, they kind of want to throw those aspects out. And so we're going to talk a little about that in terms of creation, because one thing DBH, I think he talks about more so in the framing section, also doubting the answers, of how, God being omniscient, he knows the final end of all things. So, him creating a creature that he knows is going to suffer eternal torment, like, well, then there's no balance of like that creature existing for like say 70, 80 years is not counterbalanced against an eternity of torment. So that thing's existence by an extreme margin is going to be on average a terrible existence, and it would be better for it to have, I mean, the Bible even says at one point, it'd be better to have not been born than to end up in well, of course they're not talking about eternal hell there, because the Bible doesn't teach that explicitly, but it has passages about that. And so if God is bringing these things into existence, a myriad of them in fact, knowing that it would be better for them not to have been born, and so God knows it'd be better for these creatures for them not to exist, he still brings them into existence, then that very act of creation ex nihilo is itself an act of evil and injustice. And so Hart lays that out. I think that's a really powerful point, especially when we're talking about just power being expressed for power's sake. I mean, that's such an absurd picture. It doesn't make your God any better than any of the other gods who demanded sacrifices simply to glorify themselves. But of course, the Christian God is far more merciful than that. But so that's kind of one thing I want to talk about. I wanted to get through too, with like his doubting the answers section, because that's sort of a very broad common theme found in Calvin and subsequent Calvinist ideals and ideology and literature, is this thing of like God glorifying himself and expressing power for power's sake to means of glory as being important. But it's also something you find in like the Manualist Thomist tradition, so that's important. So I want to get more into picking that apart. But I think kind of continuing our theme of, talking a little bit more personal stories, or at least some more background. Do you want to start off by talking maybe about why you now doubt the force of the argument that used to convince you, C.S. Lewis's free will argument? Do you want to start off? I was
thinking of deferring that a bit later, because I think that's actually that's the better argument actually. So I'll save the better arguments for later. Also because that's the last meditation of his DBH's new book. The fourth meditation is on the incoherence of the free will defense. So perhaps at the moment we could focus on this particular section of the Doubt in the Answers, where he talks about Calvinism. Okay, so there's a couple of answers he doubts in this section. I won't go into all of them in depth, because I think some of them we will discuss later when we talk about Thomism. But after talking about just the let me just quote him. So he says, if we were not so stupefied by the hoary and venerable myth that eternal damnation is an essential element of the original Christian message, we would not even waste our time with so preposterous a conjunction. And so he says, from the perspective of Christian belief, the very idea of punishment that is not ultimately remedial, about restoring, that is dubious from a Christian perspective. And so, but then he goes on to talk about after he talks about how the any logical definition of penal justice has to have a proportion between, in forensic terms, a mens rea and an actus reus, which is legal terminology which people may know, about the intentions of the knowledge and the powers of the person committing the crime being proportionate to the objective wickedness of the crime, but then he talks about another even feebler attempt is the traditional view that the soul can't alter its orientation after death. And then he talks about the Roman Catholic. This is quite a quintessentially Roman Catholic view in history. The idea of if you don't, you go to hell if you die in mortal sin. This is Roman Catholic language, which I can critique on another occasion, but I think it actually just refutes itself, to be honest. But I mean, the very idea of how God could be limited by someone's death, determining their eternal destiny, that is just intuitively nonsense. Even though it seems so commonsensical to so many Catholics. But yeah, anyway, so then he says, I prefer the honesty of, or the logical consistency of Calvinism, rather than the Thomists, which would say, free will is compatible with eternal damnation, because unlike the evil Calvinist God, because the Thomists, funnily enough, they hate Calvinism, but they're not really too much different, ironically. So because all they do is they say that God permits. They make it like a really silly distinction between God's permissive or antecedent will and his consequent will, and they'll say that even though if God antecedently willed the good for everyone, he doesn't mean he consequently wills the good of everyone. And so it's a rather silly distinction between conflicting wills of God. But yeah, at least the Calvinist would say, on the other hand, that they would bluntly just say that God predestines some people to salvation, and then God predestines other people to damnation, eternal damnation. And so and this is stated quite precisely in Book 3 of Calvin's Institutes, where Calvin goes so far as saying that even the fall, of Adam and Eve sinning, that was predestined, which even Augustine didn't go that far. But yeah, so to talk about Calvinism now in a little bit more detail. He in the next paragraph I'm just following, he provides what I think is the most perfect analogy of what the Calvinist God looks like. And I genuinely don't think that this is actually a straw man, but rather quite an accurate analogy, representing Calvin's God. So I'm just going to quote the section. It's not too long. He says, he compares Calvin's God to the Roman Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD. Right, so, and then he says, so the Emperor Domitian, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, once invited one of his stewards to dine with him in his private apartments. Yes, and he gave him, and this steward, he had no right to expect all this lavish gifts from the emperor. But the next day, Domitian ordered that the steward be crucified. Right. Now that is impressive. It was as grand a demonstration of absolute sovereignty. Sorry, I just lost the quote. it was as grand a demonstration of absolute sovereignty as one could ever imagine, and perfect proof of how immeasurably far above the level of the ordinary categories of good and evil such sovereignty operates. It showed with utter clarity that the gifts imparted by absolute power are entirely gracious, as the Calvinists would say, it's a miracle that God saves anyone in the first place, as they often say. Entirely gracious, the gifts that this emperor gave. And they've, he had no right to presume the gift that he gave him. And it also proved just as emphatically that such power is bound to no, common measure of justice or mercy. And so properly reveals itself in the sheer capriciousness of its malice, no less than in the lavishness of its largesse. Beautiful way of putting it. And then he says, it's an old adage of certain streams of Reformed thought to say that God could have created us all for eternal torment if he wanted to. And it would have been perfectly just. It would have been perfectly just for God to do so because it lay in his power. Once again, this emphasis on absolute power or sovereignty, which is, curiously enough, more of a 16th century, influenced more by a 16th century idea of absolute sovereignty. When the nation state arose around this time. But yeah, anyway, to continue, he says, to me, this seems like the most decadent theology imaginable and certainly blasphemous through and through, which is characteristically provocative Hartian language. But I think I agree completely that to quote what he says, the God of Calvinism is really Domitian omnipotent, which would rile many Calvinists to say that, but because Domitian was someone who persecuted Christians. So to compare Calvin's God to one of the evil emperors who is probably represented in the Book of Revelation as persecuting the Christians is not a little provocative. I admit, but no, it is. Unlike the free will defense, which I'll talk about later, this is the most morally depraved version of Christianity you could ever come up with, to be honest. It's, as DBH has said on other occasions, this God is worse than Satan, because at least Satan has a perspective, Satan
has a purpose, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, it's just, it also blows my mind, just quickly on this point, why does grace have to be limited? What he says, grace universally given is still grace, right? So yeah, I mean, we would readily admit that no one deserves God's grace because we're not infinitely good in our essence, like God, obviously. So we don't deserve. So we don't deserve God's goodness. But still, if God, the idea of God imparting grace to every person who he created is far from a corruption of justice, the truest fulfillment of justice, is it not? Because, but yeah, anyway, so it's very common for Calvinists to say here, and at this point of the argument, to say to make a kind of false dichotomy between God's justice and his mercy, and so they'll say, yes, God is merciful and loving, but he's also just, so they kind of portray God as this kind of schizophrenic, who I say a more active schizophrenic, whereas I'd say that the Thomist God is more of a passive schizophrenic, in the sense that he permits absent-mindedly, in a sense, some people to damn themselves forever, whereas the Calvinist God would willingly have, on the one hand, this supposedly goodwill, to save his elect, and then on the other hand, um, in order to satisfy the demands of justice and his perfect sovereignty, he needs to put consign certain persons to eternal hell, eternal conscious torment, right? But yeah, this is just a corruption of both justice and mercy. Because whenever a Calvinist says to me nowadays, that their image of God is in order to satisfy God's justice, well, I just simply say, I'm sorry, Mr. Calvinist, that is not even just, So if you want to be so concerned about, overemphasizing in a sentimental way, God's love and His mercy, put that aside. Still, there's nothing just at all about this idea. There's nothing. This is not justice. This is yeah. So anyway, so that's I think I talked a little bit about that on a podcast I had with Jordan, which some people could listen to later if they want. But I in that podcast I compared Calvinists to the ancient heretics, the Gnostics, when they try to divorce God's justice from His mercy. In a sense, they are similar to the Gnostics who tried to divorce the Old Testament God, who was wrathful and angry. They tried to divorce that from the New Testament God, and so ironically, they are committing this heresy in many ways, if in a subtle way. So, but yeah, any other? I think, unless you have any other thoughts about Calvinism.
I think that's all important. I said a couple more. There's a couple more quotes from his book that were really good.
Yeah.
At one point, he's like, "It's hard for me to know exactly how to respond to this version of Christianity," because he said partially because he knows it's based on such a really, as he puts it, notoriously confused reading of Scripture, descending from Augustine's inability to read Greek. But he also says, however, it is because I regard this picture of God thus produced to be a metaphysical absurdity, a God who is at once supposedly the source of all things, and yet also one whose nature is necessarily thoroughly polluted by arbitrariness. And no matter how orthodox Calvinists might protest, there is no other way to understand the story of election and dereliction that Calvin tells. I think that's really interesting too, because he said before that Calvinists will object to my use of arbitrary there, but which they have no right to do, because that's all it is. Because they have this picture in which no one deserves God's grace. It's not any of our own actions that merit it, but also God doesn't have to do it. So there's no distinguishing factor between, in which way God would choose. It's like he's picking out of a hat. They're like, well, no, because they want to say there's some intention there, but also there's nothing to do with our merit, and so it's all about God's glory. Well, surely His glory isn't affected by whom He destroys, or maybe it's just by number. So there's no way in their picture logically around the sheer arbitrariness and indeterminacy of God's decision of who to pre-elect to damnation and who not. There's nothing in that picture that's anything other than sheerly brutally arbitrary, and yet they're going to object to that all day long, which of course, as DBH says, they have no right to do. So that's important. And then he says at one point, he says, if that were Christianity, it would be too psychologically diseased a creed to take seriously at all, and its adherents would deserve only a somewhat acerbic pity, not respect. If this is one's religion, then one is simply a diabolist who has gotten the names in the story confused. So that's, as you said, in characteristically provocative Hartian language there, but it's, it's there, it's true. And I think one thing that's important is also that you kind of briefly noted on is the idea that grace is no less grace because it's infinite or because it applies to all universally, because that's one thing he talks about in the book too. That's really one common objection you get too. It's not a super popular objection anymore because people have, slowly but surely started to realize how absurd it is to say that if all are saved, well, that makes salvation less special for us. And so this is actually an argument some people have used. In fact, I think Trent Horn there's a pretty popular Catholic apologist said something along these lines. I was listening to his like response to DBH like in a podcast or like reading
Yes.
something. And so I think this is like a popular Catholic apologist like now who said something along these lines. It's not super popular anymore because it's really just really confused. But this guy is just pretty recent, and it's like it doesn't make salvation less special, and in fact, the averse is true. It's a lot more special. So I think that's important that you touched on that. I don't know if you had any more on that, but I thought that was a really important element, and like that comes up because people will say, well, like, well, then what's the point? They'll even say things along those lines, like, well, what's the point then of salvation if everybody gets it? It's like, what do you mean, what's the point? That is the point. So like, it really doesn't make any sense, but still, it's an objection that you encounter. So I don't know if you had anything more on that. If not, we can move on. But I thought that
Yeah.
was important to cover.
I just have a brief thought on that.
Good.
I don't really like making generalizations like dichotomies between two groups, but it must be said, I think, that there are generally speaking two kinds of people, who are one person. Some people are more universalist in the sense that they are they're not just concerned about their in-group, but they are open to other people's experience, I guess, which is one of the 5 personality traits, I think, or whatever. But there's other people who are more what I'd call particularist in the sense that they more want to emphasize the specialness of their in-group identity. So I'm just sort of trying to assess this in very broad terms from a psychological perspective. There seem to be, so it's not two hard and fast groups, everyone fits into this group and another group, but like it's kind of like a continuum. Some people want to more emphasize the exclusiveness of the Christian religion, which happen to be more conservative people, obviously. But and the other people would, which is anathema to the conservatives. They will want to emphasize the inclusive aspect to Jesus's teachings, which the more progressives would argue is a fulfillment of Jesus's teachings rather than corruption of it. But yeah, I just think it's interesting how even that Thomist, Trent Horn, who in other occasions would want to criticize Calvin's God, ends up defending a God what is not that different to Calvin's God, which is quite curious, isn't it? I think that more traditional manualist tradition of Thomism is, at least in the last 40 years in philosophy of and theology, has become increasingly shown to be philosophically incoherent and bankrupt and all that sort of thing. So I think it's pretty marginal in mainstream philosophy of religion, which is something I was talking to you about earlier over Messenger, remember? The idea of, I think it's only William Lane Craig is one of the few people in philosophy of religion who still tries to argue for an exclusivist idea of Christianity, which is the idea that you must explicitly assent to salvation, and you must believe in Jesus before you die. Whereas an inclusivist idea, which is not necessarily a universalist one, inclusivism just means it's a more broader scope. You can still be saved even if you don't explicitly believe in the propositional claims of a religion like Christianity. But yeah, I'd say like the majority of mainstream philosophy of religion, they don't take seriously at all exclusivism, because it's nonsense. I look forward to your article. I think which you'll eventually write on the say on exclusivism.
Yeah. Well, part of the reason I slowed down writing, because remember I told you a while back I was working that article.
Yeah.
I got like 500 words into it, and then I just kind of like stopped and never really went back to it. And I worked on like articles after that because, as you say, like it's just kind of, it's such an absurd position that like taking the time to argue against it is almost like, it's like with David Bentley Hart, his recent review of Richard Dawkins' book. It's like,
oh yeah,
it's really worth anyone's time to sit down and write this, or even my time, or anyone's time to read this. Like, it's not like anybody that should be taken seriously is taking this view seriously. So it's not like, other projects I could work on with, like, political philosophy where people take really terrible ideas very seriously. But it is funny you mentioned William Lane Craig, and it's kind of an interesting tie-in to talking about hell in general, and just seeing how absurd, like, defensive hell can get. Like, for example, I don't know if you're familiar, but William Lane Craig had a debate a while back with Ray Bradley, who's actually an atheist philosopher, but they had a debate on hell, and it's just funny to watch the debate because Craig gets, like, destroyed. Like, he just gets cornered and, like, absolutely thrashed. Like, it's because he's just trying to, like, as Hart talks about in the book, like, he mentions this a couple of times, like, no matter how brilliant you metaphysics are, like, if you just start from logically contradictory premises, you're not going to get anywhere. Like, no matter how clever you are from that point, if you start with contradictions, you're not going to end up anywhere but contradictory. And so that's like with Craig. He's obviously smart and a good philosopher and a great apologist and debater. Like, even he, the eternal hell view is just so asinine that it's like, he just got absolutely trashed by this atheist philosopher, kind of who knew what he was talking about with philosophy of religion. And so, that's kind of been Craig's debating history. Anytime he debates someone who knows what they're talking about, he doesn't fare as well. For example, like with Paul Draper. But yeah, so that's a side note about Craig. But yeah, so that is definitely interesting that, and it is an interesting note about, like, Trent Horn, like the Thomists, like how this, ordinarily these views they would condemn, they end up, like, sort of subtly endorsing. So yeah, that's good. If we have anything more there, you can go into it. But if not, you can move into the Thomist and some of the more Thomist answers. But I don't know, is there anything else we need to cover?
Yeah, just a really brief comment going back to William Lane Craig, which I just can't help inserting another criticism of him. He's also argued in print, and I think in the 90s. He's tried to argue against this famous argument, which has begun, I think, in Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's a German theologian. The argument goes something like this: the first premise is, that supremely worthwhile happiness is a kind that it could survive the complete disclosure of truth about the universe, and one possesses it only when one is filled with love for others. And the second premise is supremely worthwhile happiness cannot rest on deception or falsehood, false beliefs, nor can it exist if there are people who know of but do not love. And then the third premise is love can jeopardize our happiness if those who we love suffer, right? Especially if they suffer everlastingly, obviously. And then the fourth premise, therefore, to have supremely worthwhile happiness, you must be able to know about the genuine fate of those whom you love, right? And then the last, so I can only know the fate of those who I love if they are ultimately in heaven with you, right? And therefore, no one can be damned forever. So this is a kind of, this corresponds quite nicely to an argument, a more effective argument, which DBH makes in the third meditation of his book about how personhood, the linking interconnections between persons makes the idea absurd in its own, sense as well. Now, William Lane Craig, you know what he does? Guess how he tries to avoid this argument? So he says,
mind control. I don't know.
No, memory wipe.
That's what I meant. Yeah, memory wipe. No
Yeah.
way.
So he tries to argue that either God could wipe the memory of those who he love, those they love, or that the beatific vision may be so all-consuming that that they never turn their thoughts or even remember about their loved ones. Both options are utterly ridiculous and so unbefitting of a Christian ethic that I don't have any words, to be honest. I mean, just briefly, like, what? How? Craig is not a Calvinist. He's more of an Arminian Molinist. But how the heck does that not sound like the cruel Calvinist God who does such a thing to his humanity. Like he seems to think that's not cruel, but rather merciful for God to do such an action. But that's ridiculous. If we're in heaven, in the new creation, it should make us not less aware of other people's sufferings, but more aware of other people's sufferings. Because, if we're becoming more like Christ, who himself, descended into the depths of suffering and, dying death on a cross, it makes no sense at all that we will potentially forget the sufferings of others, our loved ones. That's ridiculous. I mean, like like for example, like you're not a Christian, and I cannot imagine that my memories with you, our relationship, with each other, all those memories just wiped out. It's just it should give people nightmares to be. Anyway, so that's just another jab at William Lane Craig's idiocies.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's valid because that is just like,
Oh.
I mean, he's obviously reaching there, and this is what DBH points out too, that like people would not defend things so absurd. Like they're just, you could never be presented like a parallel argument that they would take as like rational or acceptable. It's only because they think they have like to be committed to it because of like this commitment to like the Christian creed and it being essential to that creed. They feel like they have to defend it. If it weren't for that, a person who's generally pretty smart like Craig would not defend something that's so like just patently absurd. Like it's the same thing with like his Bradley debate. He goes into talking about like, natural phenomena like earthquakes being explained by like angels and demons, and it's like, dude, you're reaching so much. Like it's so it's great to like push him that far into like just defending these just really dumb positions. But so I mean, then of course we could do a whole episode on Craig. I mean, other than the fact he's a theistic personalist and Protestant and
heresy.
so on and so forth.
Heresy.
There's plenty to not like. There's things to like about Craig. There's plenty to not like about Craig.
Yeah.
Mainly his rather fundamentalist tendencies towards readings of scripture and exegesis and views of hell and things like that. But yeah, good. We covered the Calvinists and William Lane Craig a little bit, so we're getting all the necessary jabs in.
Yeah.
Because one thing that's kind of relevant to discussion, I think we touched on, but I want to talk about in relation to like memory wiping, God being like a memory wiper. But things I think you had this argument, and then I read it in his book too, in Hart's book, that is about like kind of scripture using language about God, like reference to analogy and using divine attributes like analogously to human actions. So talking like, for example, about passages where Jesus constantly portrays God as like this father figure, but then also has passages of talking about how like human fathers should treat their children. Like if you know how to give good gifts to your children, so much more than does your heavenly Father know to give good gifts to you. So I think DBH draws this argument. You could probably lay it out a little better. Just kind of parallel of like, well, if we're thinking of God correctly, then as like this father figure, but infinitely more good. He's obviously, and that's when he used this, because we touched on this earlier, but I wanted to go back to it. That's where he ties it in to talking about discipline. He's like, and so even finite fathers, even like human fathers, the only disciplining they do of their children is ultimately for a purpose of, bringing them back in and like for correcting behavior, but it's never like eternal and it's never for no reason. Like any discipline is for the purpose of correction, basically. And so that's the distinction. And then the Hart draws that analogy of God's discipline being for correction at an infinitely more loving and good and fatherly sense, and therefore that tying into salvation of like no eternal punishment. It's funny you mentioned that argument, because Bertrand Russell even had that argument a while ago of like the idea of an eternal hell for a finite amount of sins is just incoherent, and so Hart shares that assertion or assumption. So I think that's an interesting point too. Like when we're thinking of God as a father, any kind of fatherly discipline is only for the purpose of correction, and so to think of God's discipline for us after our deaths, even for any other purpose other than correction, doesn't make sense. Like what is the discipline achieving if it's eternal, or even if it's annihilation? Like what is he achieving there? Is he just displaying his power to those who are already saved, who already know how powerful he is? Like, is it just for the purpose of, again, we've already talked about how it being for the purpose of his glory is so arbitrary and confused. It's not really even worth taking seriously either. But like, what is the point of discipline if not for corrections? That's another thing I think about thinking of hell as formulated as a place of eternal torment being incoherent, is like, what is that torment for? What's the accomplishment? At a level, it just becomes completely arbitrary and like pointless. Like, we're just suffering for what? Just so we get it, we messed up, like, what now? Like, so I think there's an interesting point there about how discipline has to be for a purpose. Like, there has to be a reason for correction. And so if there's no reason for this discipline to achieve, then like, why does it exist? So that kind of goes into a little bit too of like, there's a little bit of a piggyback there with Craig and just the general defenses. So I don't know if you had anything more on that, but I really liked that point, because I was like, yeah, what is the point of this eternal hell doctrine even supposed to be? Like, what is being achieved by it? Like, is God getting some sort of like sick utilitarian pleasure out of us suffering for eternity? Like, no, probably not. When God does it correctly. So I don't know if you had anything else more there, but I thought that point was interesting too, like how it's kind of an incoherent notion on those grounds.
Yeah, I think that links back to what I said earlier about how often there's some people, the more particularist kinds, conservative kinds, who tend to emphasize a retributivist idea of justice at all costs, and the other, more universalist types, in the broader sense of the word universalist, right? They tend to emphasize the restorative function of justice. I just think that the impasse between these sort of two sorts of people is largely due to just a different idea of what justice is for. If justice is just for just to satisfy a penalty, then there's no need, to for God to be to continue extending his hand out, so to speak, to his sinful creation. He can just give up on them, essentially. But if, according to Christian revelation, God is like, like a father, a loving father, which is the dominant image that Jesus uses of God, which I think is significant, right? Then paternal love has nothing to do with just like proportion, like just paying back, tit for tat, pro quid quo, it's paternal love in humans, at least the non-depraved paternal love, versions, is all about total ceaseless abandon, to quote what he says, about giving yourself up, being concerned about the benefit of the other. In short, benevolence, which literally means, goodwill, seeking goodwill, I just think that this could link now to the discussion of Thomism.
Yes.
Perfect. Good. Okay. Because in the next paragraph, from what I just quoted, he says, one of the more irksome complaints often raised against any moral critique of the infernalist orthodoxies is that it involves judging the acts of God according to some ethical standard applicable to finite creatures, and thereby attempts to trespass upon the inaccessible transcendence of the one who creates all things for his own purposes. Now, this goes into a common discussion I have with fellow Thomists of my acquaintance, which is, so they will tend to say, God is not a God. So they are, first, you can commend them. They are, not theistic personalists. So they are classical theists who believe, and I agree, that God is not a finite ethical agent, who you can judge according to. So I agree with that, but that doesn't mean that an image of God where he's not in some sense culpable for allowing people to reject him forever. That doesn't mean that he's justified, quote unquote, forgive the anthropomorphism, to because that makes a mockery of classical theism, I think. Because the reason is precisely because God is not a finite ethical agent, but rather transcendent moral agency as such. He's the good as such. That's precisely the reason why we can say we would expect God to act in certain ways and expect God to not act in other ways, not like a corrupt father, like we said earlier. And so if he's infinitely benevolent, infinite and an act of infinite willing and loving of the good, then all of his acts must be expressive of his essential nature. And so that's what I think, to go back to a point about analogy, which I think is extremely crucial in talking about God. We are permitted, not just permitted, but required to come up with all sorts of analogical conclusions, about how God might act. And so I think even though we may not be able to judge, this event, this earthquake, this isolated event, disproving God's existence, whatever, what we can do is that we can judge the plausibility of the overall story which Christians tell, right? And if we know, based on what we do know, based on God's revealed nature through Jesus, right? If we know that it's radically implausible that he would not manifest his infinite benevolence, in a way which always is seeking, the good of his creation, however corrupted and misguided they are, then we're not doing Christian theology, to put it extremely bluntly. I think that we're just speaking gibberish. We're speaking nonsense. If there's this, and you can't preserve this analogical language between good. Words like, when we use words like good and just, and those usual moral, very common moral words that we use, they mean something. And if they mean something complete opposite, then, as I said, you're talking gibberish. So, yeah.
That's good. That's what you had on Thomism.
Yeah, so I think that that is my main criticism of Thomism. But the more, now to move on just to the general way that they try to argue using free will, the free will defense.
The original where we kind of wanted to do towards the end was your original thing on free will, like Lewis's argument. Kind of why it's not convincing.
Right.
Okay,
I'm just trying to think about how to put this.
I don't know what you think, but I think that's good if you want to do that. You want to move into like the more general criticism of that, and that'll put us around an hour and a half, which I think will be good. And we'll probably be able to do like subsequent video, or probably put us a little past an hour and a half maybe. And that'll be good because we can do we'll probably have to do like some subsequent videos on his further meditations. And we can, of course, we'll build more on universalism. At this point, we're just on formulating the question and doubting the answers. So I think that'll be a good good wrap up to end with like that argument, given we'll kind of cover some of the broad answers and doubting them. So yeah, I don't know what you think, but I think that's a good direction to go. And so yeah, if you want to keep going with the criticism there.
Okay, so this is something I also mentioned on my first podcast with Jordan, is the central issue that I see in the modern free will defenses of hell is that they are committed to, ironically, a pagan modern existentialist idea of freedom, like being almost just purely negative, to use Isaiah Berlin's typology, negative and positive freedom. They say, freedom is just about choosing, and having no external constraints and barriers. Therefore, someone is free. But the traditional, the classical, and the medieval view of freedom, true freedom, which is truly a coherent and unified tradition. It's not an isolated view. Right? Is the view that true freedom is about the fulfillment of your nature, as a human, right? And so someone to be free, to be fully free, they need to be joined to the first good, God. And so anything that, separates humans from that final end, that teleology, even if it's, your someone's choice, that is, as he says, a form of bondage to the irrational. And so that's the main reason why I came to the conclusion that the free will defense is not so much morally objectionable, but just simply not, incoherent. It just makes no sense. Like, because we can know this just the way we act. We are intentional creatures. We act according to, telos, in the way we act. And so anything that you choose is, you do it for a purpose. You don't just do it randomly, like he says, it would be like indistinguishable from like an earthquake, occurring if, someone like the idea of them freely choosing hell forever. Like, how the heck could that be a fully free, like a free choice when they are ignorant of the good in some way, and necessarily they must be ignorant in some way. And so this is, I guess, the main issue. It's just that that it is in many ways a betrayal of the classical theism tradition of, like you find in Thomas Aquinas, where the intellect and the will are inextricably tied to each other. And so, we're created to seek the good as perceived by the intellect in every action that we do, And so we can never actually will evil as evil in itself. We can only ever choose something. Even someone like Hitler, they chose the evil actions that they did. They chose it because they genuinely thought it was good. So even if their idea of goodness is depraved and utterly, they deluded essentially, still they are choosing what they perceive to be good. And so I think this in and of itself almost refutes the idea, like, of the idea of free will, defense of eternal hell, because like, they could never. It's just impossible, like metaphysically impossible, for someone to willingly choose evil, like, as their, like, most, the deepest motivation. You don't just, Hitler, he didn't just go out and, decide that Jews should be exterminated because he knew that this was evil. He thought it was good. So it's just ridiculous. Like, so we created it in a way, where, just to quote the book again, he summarizes it quite well. He says, we do one of two things when we act. We either pursue a purpose as an end in itself, or for the sake of an end beyond itself. And then this is from the last meditation. And then he says, you'll find that no finite object can wholly attract the rational will in the latter way. So even in the suicide, someone committing suicide, they are, in order to escape suffering, they perceive to be good. That this is not, even if they are deceived, in the sense that they shouldn't, that life could get better. They despair in life. Still, their action is made possible by this, what he calls this more aboriginal orientation towards the good. which motivates every single action of the saint, no less than the Hitler, So, so that's why he concludes that section of the meditation. He says, if then there is such a thing as eternal perdition as the result of an eternal refusal of repentance, it must also be the result of an eternal ignorance, and therefore has nothing really to do with freedom at all. So no, this is the last quote, not only is an eternal free rejection of God unlikely, it is a logically vacuous idea. And I think that summarizes my view quite well, is that it just has, even Shane, Shane Wagner, when he commented on one of my posts where I made this point, and he said, it's just ridiculous, the idea of someone freely willing to, choose life away from the good, the eternal good. Why would anyone do that? Willingly? It's just nonsense. But yeah, so
yeah, that is, because especially in the Thomist tradition, this notion of evil as a privation.
Yes, that's the key point to make.
Yeah, this notion of evil as a privation, not having this positive existence its own, just being the absence of some good. And so obviously, if our faculties are not in full, or if our rational faculties are not fully functioning, there's some privation there. They're not completely actualized as good, because if our, and so this is the point Hart makes too, is that our very will, our very ability to have meaningful choices and to orient towards the good, is grounded in God as the foundation and ground of all being, and the infinite source of being itself. And it's he uses language and experience of God a lot, in whom we live, move, and have our being.
Yeah.
So God as being the very source, both the source and the ideal to which we are ordered. And so to say that we could, we only have true freedom by means of God's imparting it. So to say that we could have full proper freedom and use it to reject the good itself, being God, is just completely incoherent. We couldn't. It's not even possible. Even
metaphysically,
theory,
yeah.
It's not that it's possible, but would never happen because of some causal factor. No, it's just completely metaphysically impossible for these things to happen. If we're fully ordered towards the good and have full impartation of free choice, we're going to be ordered towards the good, which is God. There's no any rejection or choice to reject the good is going to be in the Thomistic jargon or a privation. And so you can't fully exercise this freedom in light of a privation of the mind. So that whole idea, Shane, you, I, me, we're all DBH, we're all in agreement. That doesn't make any sense. It's just no way in hell, pun intended, that could possibly even be a picture of reality that fits anything. So I think that's a good point too. This free will defense kind of starts from this really confused notion of what freedom is under God's, given God's existence. So that's a super good point. Maybe that's a really common point too. Of course, luckily that's a point the Calvinists can't use. So there's a leg up on them there. Yeah.
Anyway, I think I'm gonna have to go soon. But is there anything else you want to say lastly? I think we've almost sort of 2 hours, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah. Are you any concluding thoughts or?
I was gonna let you go. I think we've done a good job encapsulating the first two sections there, but I don't know if you had any closing remarks. I'll say something towards the end, but yeah, if you had anything, wrap it all together, or maybe tease next time, or both.
Yeah, so perhaps next time we could just talk about how both, I guess, the Calvinist view and the more Arminian view, of which emphasizes free will, that they both, in many ways, how do you put it? In some sense, is parasitic of the more pagan, modern existentialist ideas of freedom, sort of a Heideggerian kind of idea, which is quite ironic. But yeah, I could talk about that for ages because historically, I'm really fascinated by the idea of uh, uh, which is expressed well, not just by David Bentley Hart, but other modern scholars, philosophers like D.C. Schindler. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's really good. He was on the panel of the Notre Dame when David Bentley Hart talked about consciousness. He's really good. But yeah, he talks a lot about how historically the idea of the classical legacy, of freedom and the intellect, the will, and all of these moral concepts has, in some senses, become distorted round about the Reformation, slightly before period, which is something I'll talk about later. But anyway, I think I'll finish there. Is there anything else that you wanted to say in conclusion?
Yeah,
or
no, I think that's okay. Good to wrap it up. Yeah, no. Let's see. I think that's a good idea. We can kind of go more into that. I mean, we touched on some of those themes here, but I think next time that'd be good. And I'll have to break up this whole like universalism thing probably into 2 or 3 parts actually, because there's a lot to cover even with just DBH's book, not to mention the larger tradition. But yeah, just as a closing, I'd say kind of good to know where we've covered kind of how views of the atonement, views of and our conceptions of God as the proper classical theist picture as being in itself, goodness in itself, and all that are really relevant and important. And so it's good to come into this with the proper understanding of context of God, Scripture, Christian history, Christian theology, atonement, all that.
Yeah,
So I think we recapped that fairly well. There's of course a lot more to go into with all those things, but yeah, I think that's about it. It's good so far, but just to tease next time, yeah, we'll probably also try to move into the next 1 or 2 of Hart's meditations on so like
sure.
we mentioned it a little bit earlier briefly with original sin, but the first meditations on the moral meaning of creation ex nihilo, and so
Yeah,
yeah, we'll probably go into that at least on the next one. But yeah, I think that's it as far as I know. So yeah, if you're good, that's good for me. I
sure.
want to say thanks again for coming on. Hope everybody enjoyed this. I know having Samuel on is always fun. Our conversations are always good. So he'll be back
Yeah,
not long from now. So thanks for coming back on, man.
it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this thing for quite a while, as you know.
Yeah, me too. And now we have more to look forward to. There's a lot to come. So yeah, that's
Cool.
good. That puts us about almost an hour 40. So that's perfect. So yeah, I'll go ahead and stop this. Thank you everybody for watching, assuming you did, which if you're listening to this portion, you have. So thank you. And yeah, we'll be back soon.